In my last lecture, I talked about bones. We started talking about the skeletal system, and we talked about what are the jobs of the skeletal system, and then I got into the structure of a long bone, and we went through all these terms here about the long bone, the epiphysis, the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, periosteum, endosteum, and we talked about spongy bone, and we talked about compact bone. So today I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on compact bone versus spongy bone, and also a little bit more about marrow, which we talked about. So let's get into that. So bone marrow is an extremely important part of your anatomy. And bone marrow, there's two types actually. There's red marrow and there's yellow marrow. And they live in different places. So red marrow, when you think of bone marrow, you probably hopefully think of blood, right? So your bone marrow is responsible for producing your blood cells. Your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. That gets made by your red bone marrow. And that is found in spongy bone. That's where you're going to find red marrow. So where are you going to find it? You're going to find it in the epiphyses, or the ends of the long bones, and you're also going to find it in your flat bones. So for example, your sternum, your pelvic bones. So for example, a bone marrow biopsy where they're going to pull out some bone marrow, they actually go right into your hip bone because flat bones are full of red marrow. So that is where your body's producing these blood cells and then sending it out to the body to do their jobs. Yellow marrow, on the other hand, is mostly just fat, and that is found in the medullary cavity. So that is going to be in the diaphysis. And that does not make blood cells. That is really just fat for energy storage. And actually, if I'm going to be honest, it's pretty delicious. If you've never tried bone marrow, if you've ever gone to a fancy restaurant, like a French restaurant or Italian restaurant, you might see bone marrow on the menu. And what they'll do is they'll split the bone down the middle and then they just roast it. And this may sound gross, but it's actually delicious, and it usually comes with toast, and I call it meat butter because it's kind of got a buttery consistency because it's fatty, but it's really rich because it's from meat. So it's a really rich, fatty meat butter. But that's going to be the yellow marrow that you're going to find in the diaphysis. So just to make sure we understand, red marrow makes your blood, so red is blood, that's easy to remember, and it produces your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets, and that's going to be found in your spongy bone. So epiphyses of the long bones, and also any of your flat bones, which we're going to talk more about later, but your flat bones are made up of spongy bone as well. Yellow marrow is going to be in that medullary cavity. So this is just an image of that there now. You can see there's compact bones surrounding the medullary cavity. We have our periosteum, which we talked about yesterday. We have our compact bone surrounding it. And then right down that medullary cavity, there's blood vessels in there, which is going to bring blood to your cells. But there's also this fatty yellow marrow. Let's talk a little bit more about compact versus spongy bone. So let's first talk about our compact bone. So what you're looking at here is an image. Let me move my head over here. What you're looking at here is an image of compact bone. And compact bone surrounds the medullary cavity. So if you take a look here at this image, let me get my pointer. If you take a look here at this image, this is the medullary cavity, right? This is the compact bone on either side, which is going to prevent that bone from breaking. And we have our endosteum on the inside here. So what we're looking at here is a zoomed in image of right here. So this is like a piece of cake cut out, and you're seeing that here. So these would be the blood vessels that you're seeing traveling up and down that medullary cavity right there. Well, here's the thing about bone. It's hard. And because it's hard, blood vessels need to get through it. And you can't put a blood vessel through bone. It doesn't work. So what ends up happening is this bone actually forms around the blood vessels. So what you end up seeing happening here is bone forms in these circular structures, which we're going to call osteons. And I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit. But what you'll notice is this compact bone forms in these circular bundles, which are called osteons. And the reason why they form that way is they form around the blood vessel. All these cells need oxygen. All these cells need glucose. So they want to get as close to the blood source as they can. So at a certain point, these cells are going to get too far away from those blood vessels, so you're going to get a new osteon. So when you think about it, basically your bone, your compact bone, is made up of long osteons, which are bundled together to make them stronger. And there's a good way it also makes your bone stronger. If I took a bunch of pencils and taped them together into a big bundle, right? So let's say I take I have a pencil, a pen. If I take these things and I bundle them together, they're going to be much stronger. It's going to be really hard for me to break them because they're individual pieces that are bundled together. If this was just one thick pen, I could break it much easier. But by having it be individual thin, pieces that are all bundled together, it makes it much, much stronger. And that is one reason why we have osteons. So what are we looking at here? What we're looking at, let's look at a couple terms. First off, this area right here around the blood vessels is actually spongy bone. So we have our endosteum here, and then we have our spongy bone. Spongy bone is made up of bone and open spaces. There's a term for the bone. It's called trabeculae. Trabeculae are just the bony plates of spongy bone. So imagine a sponge, right? A sponge has a lot of open space, and then it has the spongy part. The spongy part is going to be the bone that we call trabeculae. So these little plates of bone here are called trabeculae. The canals, so there's two kinds of canals that you're going to see here of blood vessels passing through. There are horizontal canals, which connect the blood vessels to the main blood vessels, and there's vertical canals, which bring the blood up and down to the cells. All these little dots in here, those are the osteocytes. Those are the actual bone cells. So they need to get to the blood, and the way they get to the blood is they make little tunnels, and those little tunnels are called canaliculi. So there's a lot going on here, so bear with me as I explain it. So this would be an osteocyte living inside of its lacunae. Chondrocytes, they kill themselves. We talked about that already, right? They produce a lacunae that is a completely sealed in shell, and then they suffocate and they die. Osteocytes do something similar, but they have long tendrils. Osteocytes have these long tendrils that stick out, and they actually touch each other. So what ends up happening is one osteocyte has a tendril that forms next to another osteocyte. And when the tunnels form around them, what that is, it's basically like a little tiny tunnel which connect these cells to each other. So if you take a look here, you can see all these osteocytes are connected to each other, and they eventually make their way to these blood vessels. So what makes osteocytes be able to stay alive and chondrocytes die is chondrocytes do not have canaliculi. They just seal themselves in and they suffocate. Imagine like a snorkel, right? If you've ever gone snorkeling before, you have a little tube that goes up to the air. Osteocytes put out these little tubes that connect them to each other, which allow them to breathe still. So osteocytes, even though they're in a hard matrix, they can still breathe because they have these little tunnels that connect them to each other. So there's a lot going on in this slide, so I wanted to make sure I review it all. So the first type of canal, they're called Volkmann canals or perforating canals. Those are the canals that go horizontally. So this would be a Volkmann's canal. This would be a perforating canal. They bring the blood horizontally to the central canals, which are these vertical ones here, which I'm going to talk about more on the other slide. Just to make things more difficult, they name these canals differently. If they go up and down, they're called Haversian canals, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. If they go horizontally, away from the medullary cavity, they're called perforating or Volkmann's canals. So these are going to be your Volkmann's canals. The trabeculae are these little plates of bone that make up the spongy bone. The canaliculi are these little tiny canals, these little tiny tunnels that connect the osteocytes to each other. And what they do is they allow the osteocytes to survive. The osteocytes are the bone cells. So if you remember in the last unit, there were 3 types of cells found in your connective tissue other than the blood cells. There's fibroblasts, there's chondrocytes, and there's osteocytes. Chondrocytes make cartilage, osteocytes make bone. And then lacunae are the same as in chondrocytes, except these lacunae have those openings that allow for the canaliculi to connect to each other, and it lets the osteocytes survive where chondrocytes die. Let's finish this up. So an osteon is this circular concentric unit of bone. So when you look at compact bone, it's made in these little circles called osteons. And again, the reason why it forms in a circle, imagine if food is being served from a table. Everybody's going to gather around that table, right? And if you're too far away from the food, you're not going to get fed, and you're going to have to go to another table. That's essentially what's going on here. The blood vessels travel up the middle of these canals called central or Haversian canals. That's this definition here. So the horizontal ones are called Volkmann or perforating. The vertical ones are called central or Haversian, and they are what provide blood vessels to these osteocytes. So the osteocytes are really just embedded in this bone. They can't go anywhere. They're stuck. Once they form the bone around themselves, they are stuck. They've essentially painted themselves into a corner. But because they have those little canaliculi, those little tunnels between each other, they can still get blood and they can still survive. Your bones are actually full of blood. If you've ever broken a bone before, you know that. It bruises terribly. And the reason why it bruises terribly is because there's so much blood available. Okay, great. This is just another diagram where I can point some things out to you. So this would be a long bone. This would be the medullary cavity right here. You can see there's some spongy bone on the inside. That is the trabeculae. Those are the individual plates of bone. These are these osteons, these concentric circles of long bone. And in there we have our central canal or Haversian canal. We have our perforating or Volkmann's canals connecting those central canals. And then we have our little individual osteocytes are in the bone and they're connected to each other by those canaliculi. On the outside we have our periosteum, and on the inside we have our endosteum. I want to finish up by showing you a short video clip which I think is excellent in terms of explaining and just showing you a visual.
The human skeleton gives the body its shape and provides physical support for the systems contained within. It also forms part of the musculoskeletal system that enables us to move. The structure of bone is optimized so that it is strong but relatively lightweight. The interior of bone is composed of bone marrow. It is surrounded by two major types of bone tissue: cortical bone, or the hard outer shell of bone, and trabecular bone, the spongy-looking center. The amount of each type of tissue in bone is dependent on the function of that bone. The basic unit of cortical or compact bone is the osteon. It is composed of successive concentric lamellae. This structure contributes to bone strength by resisting bending. Cells called osteocytes are distributed within the concentric lamellae. Osteocytes form a complex network that is thought to be important in maintaining the viability and structural integrity of bone. At the center of the osteon is the Haversian canal. These canals contain blood vessels and nerves. The blood vessels within bone facilitate the exchange between osteocytes and the blood. Trabecular bone is present in the interior of some bones and resists compression. Osteocytes are also contained within its structure and again play an important role in sensing local changes in strain. Trabeculae are covered in a layer of flattened lining cells that are thought to be involved in the dynamic process by which bone is formed and broken down. Bone marrow is found within the interior of bones. The surrounding trabeculae and vascular network provide structural support, nutrition, and a waste removal system for the heterogeneous group of cells found within this space. Bone marrow is a site for hematopoiesis, the process by which the cellular components of blood are formed.